The wind rolled low across the valley, bending the tall grass like a whisper through graves. The sun hung red over the horizon, painting the land in colors that bled gold, rust, and sorrow. A lone rider moved along the ridge, his shadow stretching long behind him. Luke Matthews had seen enough towns and tombstones to know when a place carried ghosts, and this one did. Below him, a small ranch sat quiet, its fences half broken, the barn leaning like a tired old man. Smoke curled from the chimney, thin, hesitant, like it wasn't sure it belonged. He reined in his horse, narrowing his eyes against the dust. There was someone down there, someone watching. Abigail Monroe stood on her porch, the last of the sun catching in her dark auburn hair. Her face was pale but strong, lined with quiet defiance. She had been a rancher's wife once. Now just a widow trying to survive on borrowed land and fading hope. The rifle in her hands wasn't for hunting anymore. It was for reminding the world she still had something left worth fighting for. Luke's voice broke the silence, low but steady. "Evening, ma'am. Didn't mean to startle you." Abigail didn't lower the rifle. Her blue eyes stayed fixed on him. "Riders don't come this way unless they want something. What is it you're after?" Luke dismounted slowly, boots hitting the dirt with a dull thud. He raised his hands, just enough to show he meant no harm. "Name's Luke Matthews. I'm looking for work. Heard the Monroe place needed help moving stock, if it still stands." Her jaw tightened. "It stands. For now." The way she said it made him pause. He could hear the tremor she tried to hide. This was a woman carrying more than grief. Something else haunted this land, something that made even the silence feel dangerous. Luke took a slow step closer. "If you don't want to help, I'll ride on. But if there's trouble here, ma'am, I'd say ride alone at sundown isn't the safest thing to do." Abigail's grip on a rifle eased just slightly. She looked past him toward the road that wound through the hills. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Trouble doesn't ride up the road. Mr. Matthews, it's already here." A low creak came from a barn. Luke's head turned. The horses inside were restless, snorting and stamping. Abigail flinched, eyes darting toward the door. For a heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then a shadow moved across the slats. Luke's hand went instinctively to his revolver. Abigail froze, every muscle tense. The last of the sun disappeared behind the ridge, plunging the yard into copper twilight. "Who else is here?" Luke asked. Abigail's voice trembled. "You don't want to know." But the look in her eyes told him everything. Fear, guilt, and something darker. She wasn't just a widow guarding a ranch. She was guarding a secret. The night pressed down heavy. Coyotes called from the far hills, their cries echoing to the canyons like ghosts remembering. Luke could feel it in his bones. Something inside that barn wasn't right. He moved forward, quiet but deliberate, hand hovering near his revolver. Abigail's breath came short, her knuckles white against the rifle. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was staring at the barn like it was something alive. Luke pushed the door open just enough for moonlight to slip through. Dust drifted in the pale blue light. The horses stamped nervously, snorting and tossing their heads. And then a flicker of movement in the rafters. He whispered, "Stay here." But Abigail's whisper shot back, trembling, "Don't go in there." Her voice cracked on the last word, and that told him more than anything else. Fear, not of what might be in there, but of who? Luke stepped inside. The air was thick with straw and sweat. He scanned the shadows. Then a sound, soft, rhythmic breathing. He turned, and a figure lunged. Luke's hand moved on instinct. The revolver came up fast, but before he fired, the faint glint of something small caught his eye. Not a gun. A knife, held by trembling hands far too small for killing. A child. The boy couldn't have been more than 10. Face streaked with dirt, eyes wide, burning with terror and hunger. Abigail's voice cracked from behind him. "Jacob, stop." The boy froze. The knife fell to the ground with a dull clatter. Luke holstered his gun slowly, his voice low and steady. "You didn't tell me you had company, ma'am." Abigail stepped into barn, shoulders sinking with the weight of years she hadn't spoken of. "He's not mine," she said softly. "Not by blood. but he's all I have left. Luke studied the boy, gaunt, bruised, clothes torn. He wasn't just hiding. He'd been hunted. Who's after him? Luke asked. Abigail looked away. Her silence was louder than any words. Outside, the wind kicked up dust, and the horses shifted again, uneasy. Luke could feel the story deepening. A woman cornered, a child haunted, and a threat that hadn't yet shown its face. He bent down, meeting the boy's frightened eyes. You got nothing to fear from me, son. You hungry? The boy hesitated, then nodded. Luke reached into his saddlebag, pulled out a chunk of dry bread, and handed it to him. Abigail's lips parted, surprise softening her features. It had been a long time since she'd seen kindness that wasn't laced with cost. Luke turned to her. You were going to sell this land, weren't you? Her eyes glistened. I still might. Depends on what tomorrow brings. Luke glanced toward the horizon, a dark line of clouds crawling in heavy and low. Tomorrow's bringing more than weather. And somewhere beyond the wind came the faint echo of hooves. Distant, measured, drawing closer. Abigail heard it too. Her voice dropped to a whisper. They found him again. The sound of hooves grew louder, thundering over the ridge like distant drums of war. The barn lantern flickered with the gust that swept through the valley, rattling its chains. Luke's eyes narrowed toward the dark horizon, where shadows broke against the lightning's glow. He spoke low, measured. How many? Abigail swallowed hard. 4, maybe 5. Same ones who came before. Luke took a breath, the kind a man draws when deciding whether to live or die standing up. Then we don't run. We prepare. He turned to Jacob, the boy, whose small hand still trembled from the knife's weight. Son, you stay close to your ma. She's not my ma, Jacob blurted. Abigail's eyes flicked to him, fear and sorrow flashing beneath her composure. But Luke didn't press. He could read truth in silence better than most men could in words. The first rumble of thunder cracked above. Wind tore through the barn's gaps, carrying the smell of rain and gunpowder. Luke checked his revolver, spun the cylinder, and slid a single bullet into the chamber with a soft click of finality. Outside, a voice called through the storm. Abigail Monroe. We know the boy's in there. You hand him over, and maybe we'll leave the place standing. Jacob flinched. Abigail's hand clutched his shoulder. Her whisper broke like a prayer. Don't let them take him. Luke stepped forward, his boots crunching on the barn floor. His face was shadowed, eyes lit by lightning's flash. You got nerve coming here on a night like this. The leader's voice spat back. We got reason. That boy ain't who you think he is. Luke's jaw tightened. You talkin' reason while threatening a woman and a child? The wind howled through the valley, drowning the pause that followed. The silence that came after was worse than the storm. Then came the first gunshot, which splintered inches from Abigail's head. She ducked, pulling Jacob close. Luke spun toward the door, revolver drawn, and fired once, clean and precise. One rider fell. The others scattered, circling like wolves. Abigail's breath came ragged. Why are they after him, Luke? He turned, voice steady despite the chaos. You tell me. Lightning tore the sky in two, and for an instant he saw the truth in her eyes. Guilt, fear, a secret buried so deep it had its own heartbeat. He's not my son, she confessed. He's theirs. Luke froze. What do you mean? Abigail's voice shook, but she forced the words out. Jacob's father was one of them, a man named Vern Harlow. Luke's stomach turned cold. That name carried blood and betrayal all across the frontier. Vern Harlow, the outlaw who'd burned 3 ranches and disappeared before the war's end. You mean to tell me that boy's got Harlow blood? Luke asked quietly. Abigail nodded. He came back for him once. I sent him away. He said next time he wouldn't ask. Thunder rolled again, closer now. Luke looked at the boy, then back at the woman trembling before him. He holstered his gun. Then next time, he said, we make sure he doesn't get the chance. Outside, shadows moved between the lightning strikes. 4 riders, one still holding his arm where Luke's bullet grazed. They weren't leaving. Not until they had what they came for. Luke took his hat off, ran a hand through rain-slicked hair, and glanced at Abigail. "You ever shot a rifle, Mrs. Monroe?" Her chin lifted. "I buried 2 men who thought I couldn't." Luke almost smiled. "That's good enough for me." As the storm raged, they took their positions. The boy under the loft, Abigail crouched by the window, and Luke by the barn doors, revolver steady. Rain began to pour in sheets, the sound masking movement. Then the riders charged. Rain slammed the tin roof in hammering bursts, lightning cutting across the valley like torn silk. Luke pressed his shoulder against the barn door, revolver drawn. Abigail crouched by the window, rifle steady on the sill. The boy, Jacob, hid behind the grain sacks. Small fingers covered his ears as thunder cracked overhead. Through the storm, the riders circled, shadows on horseback, their torches spitting in the wind. The smell of wet gunpowder and burning oil filled the air. Then a voice broke through the rain. "Abigail Monroe, you've got something that belongs to me." Luke peered through a crack in the boards. His gut turned tight. A tall man dismounted, long coat flapping, face hidden beneath a wide hat. Lightning revealed a scar across his cheek. Vern Harlow. Abigail froze. Her hands trembled on the rifle. "He's supposed to be dead," she whispered. Luke's tone was quiet, cold. "Seems death don't keep good men buried, and it don't want the bad ones either." Harlow's voice rose again, sharper. "You hand me the boy, and maybe I let you keep your land." Abigail's voice cracked, anger cutting through fear. "You'll have to walk through fire to take him." Harlow laughed. "Fire's the only thing that ever made you tell the truth." Luke looked at her. There was again that shadow of guilt behind her eyes. But this wasn't the time to ask. He lifted his revolver, cocked it once. "When I give the word, aim for the horses. We're outgunned. We'll need confusion on our side." Lightning flashed, then came the signal. Gunfire erupted. The barn exploded in sound. Splintering wood, screaming horses, echoing thunder. Luke fired with precision, 2 shots in rhythm. One man went down. Another's torch tumbled into the mud, hissing out. Abigail held steady, her first shot grazing a rider's hat, the second shattering a lantern post. The storm roared, drowning everything but breath and heartbeat. Inside, Jacob whimpered. "He said he'd come for me. He said he'd never stop." Abigail turned, voice sharp with both command and care. "You keep your head down, Jacob. You hear me?" Luke reloaded, gritting his teeth. "He ain't taking you. Not tonight." Then a lull. Only the rain. Smoke. The smell of gunpowder and wet earth. Luke peered outside. Harlow's men were regrouping. One dragged a wounded partner behind a trough, shouting orders. Harlow himself stood still, arms wide, calm as sin. "You can't protect what don't belong to you, cowboy," he bellowed. Luke's reply came low, even. "Then maybe you should have held on tighter when you had it." Harlow smirked, drawing his pistol. "You don't know what you're protecting. That boy's got more than my blood. He's got my sin." Thunder rolled again. Abigail's heart slammed against her ribs. "Luke, don't listen." But Harlow's words kept cutting through the storm. "She never told you, did she? How she came by him. How she begged me to leave him behind." Luke turned, his jaw set. "Is it true?" Abigail's eyes glistened with tears and rage. "I did beg him, not for my life. For Jacob's." Outside, Harlow fired again, splinters spraying the doorway. Luke ducked, dragging Abigail down. He whispered, close enough that she could feel the tremor in his breath. "We'll sort the truth when we're alive to hear it." She nodded, trembling, and for a fleeting second their eyes locked. 2 people bound not by trust, but by shared survival. The rain didn't stop. It only grew meaner, slamming against the barn like 1,000 angry fists. Water seeped through the roof, dripping in cold streams down the wood. The lantern light flickered, shadows stretching long and wild. Luke crouched low behind a wagon wheel, breath steady but pulse hammering. His revolver was down to 3 rounds, and Harlow's men still outnumbered him 2 to 1. Abigail knelt beside the boy, whispering quiet reassurances she barely believed. "Jacob, you're safe here, you hear me? I won't let him touch you." Jacob's eyes were wide, his voice small. He said, I'm his blood. He said, I'm the reason you're alone. Tears welled, but Abigail bit them back. No, child, you're the reason I'm still alive. Outside, the sound of boots crunching in mud grew louder. Harlow's men were regrouping. Lightning flashed, and in that brief white instant, Luke saw them moving through the rain, using the fences for cover. He turned to Abigail. We can't wait it out. They'll set the place alight if they can't take it. Her voice trembled but steadied. Then what do we do? He studied the barn structure, beams, lofts, windows. Years of survival and strategy turned in his head. There's an old feed tunnel beneath the back wall. If we break through, we can reach the creek bed. You and the boy go first. Abigail's eyes widened. And you? I'll buy you time. She shook her head, tears cutting paths through soot. Luke! But before she could say more, thunder cracked again, and a bullet tore through the door beside them, which splintered, grazing Luke's arm. He hissed through clenched teeth, pressing his hand over the wound. Go! He barked. Abigail hesitated only a second, then grabbed Jacob and moved toward the back of the barn. She found the old feed hatch, half-rotted and covered with hay. Her hands shook as she pulled at the boards. Outside, Harlow's voice carried through the storm again. You always did have a savior's heart, Matthews. You can die with it if you like, or hand me the boy and walk away. Luke's reply was sharp, echoing across the valley. I ain't got a heart for dealing with devils. Another shot rang out, this one closer. One of Harlow's men had broken through the side window. Luke spun and fired, one clean shot to the chest. The man fell, his body slumping against the mud and straw. Two left, Luke muttered, reloading fast. From the corner, Abigail's voice rose. The tunnel's open. Luke turned, just as another bullet whistled past, cutting a groove into the beam beside his head. He dropped to one knee, rolled, and returned fire. A shout answered, another man down. Only Harlow remained. The outlaw stepped into the doorway, soaked to the bone, eyes gleaming with fury and triumph. You always thought you were better than me, Matthews, a drifter with morals. Look at you now, bleeding in the mud for a woman with lies in her mouth. Luke's breathing came hard. Difference between us is I fight for someone besides myself. Harlow grinned, cold and hollow. You don't even know who you're fighting for. Behind him, lightning illuminated his hand, a pistol drawn, aimed not at Luke, but toward the back of the barn where Abigail and Jacob were escaping. Don't! Luke shouted, firing first. The sound split the storm. Harlow staggered, clutching aside. He looked up, laughing through the blood on his lips. You can kill me, but you can't kill what I made. He fell forward, crashing into the mud. Luke's gun hand trembled. He waited, one breath, two, then rushed toward the back of the barn. Abigail and Jacob had reached the creek bed. She turned as Luke approached, rain cascading off his hat brim. Face pale from blood loss, but steady. It's over, he said, though his voice betrayed exhaustion. She looked toward the barn, where smoke now curled from a broken lantern. You sure? No, he said, but we're still here. That's a start. Dawn crept over the valley, pale and hesitant, painting the Red Rock Ranch in shades of ash and gold. The storm had broken during the night, leaving the air heavy with smoke and wet earth. The barn still smoldered, its beams blackened, roof sagging like a wounded beast. Luke sat on the creek's edge, shirt sleeve torn and bandaged. His eyes were fixed on the barn, though his thoughts were far away. Beside him, Abigail knelt, washing Jacob's mud-stained face. The boy's small frame shook from exhaustion, but he was alive. Will they come back? Jacob asked. Luke's gaze stayed on the horizon. Not them. He paused, voice low. But others might. Abigail wrung out the cloth, fingers trembling. You killed him, didn't you? Luke didn't look at her. Had to. She nodded slowly, fighting the sting behind her eyes. He wasn't a good man, but he was still Jacob's father. Luke's voice softened. Blood. Don't make a man worth remembering. What you do with the life you're given, that's what sticks. For a long moment, the only sounds were the creek's slow current and the restless wind pushing through the grass. Finally, Abigail said, "There's more you should know." Luke turned. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with resolve. Vern Harlow wasn't just Jacob's father. He was my husband's partner. They built this ranch together, until he killed him for it. Luke's jaw set tight. The pieces clicked in his mind like a hammer on steel. You stayed to keep the land. I stayed because he said he'd come back for the deed, and for the boy. She met Luke's gaze. Selling it was the only way to stop his name from owning me. Luke exhaled, heavy with understanding. Then maybe it's time you stop running from ghosts. Abigail's lip quivered. And what do I do instead? He turned to face her fully. You live, you rebuild, and you let the land remember better hands than his. For the first time since the gunfire, her breath steadied. She reached into her coat and pulled out the folded deed, edges burned and damp. "It's still yours if you want to buy it," she said quietly. Luke took it, stared at the ink bleeding down the page, then shook his head. "I ain't buying your land, Abigail." She frowned. "Then why stay?" He stood, sunlight catching the edge of his hat brim. "Because you don't need another man to own what you already fought for. You just need someone who'll make sure you keep it." Abigail's eyes glistened. The words weren't grand, but they carried more truth than any vow she'd ever heard. Behind them, the boy stirred. "Does that mean you're staying, Mr. Matthews?" Luke glanced at him, then at the widow. "Reckon the ranch could use one more pair of hands." A faint smile broke through her exhaustion. "And maybe one less ghost." Luke nodded once. "That too." The sun climbed higher, cutting through the fog, lighting the broken barn and the half-rebuilt fences. A new day, raw but promising. Luke slipped the revolver back into his holster and turned toward the house. "Come on, let's get you two fed. We've got a life to start mending." As they walked toward the cabin, the camera would linger on the horizon, the scars of battle behind them, the faint shimmer of peace ahead. A simple promise born from blood, rain, and the stubborn hope that even in the wildest country, redemption can take root. The weeks after the gunfire passed slowly, like the land itself was trying to breathe again. The smell of smoke still clung to the fences, and the charred timbers of the barn stood black against the horizon. But where destruction once was, hands had started rebuilding. Luke hammered new boards into place, sweat cutting lines through the dust on his neck. Abigail worked beside him. Sleeves rolled, hair tied loosely, every motion calm but resolute. The boy, Jacob, carried nails in a small tin bucket, proud of every trip he made between them. The ranch was alive again, not untouched, not unscarred, but alive. Word of the shootout had reached Red Rock Crossing before the smoke cleared. Some called Luke a hero. Others whispered he brought trouble to a widow who'd already seen too much of it. One afternoon, as Luke hitched the horses, 3 men from town rode up, faces half familiar, half hostile. "Heard tell you killed Vern Harlow," the tallest said, voice dripping with accusation. Luke didn't flinch. "He came looking for a fight. I obliged him." The man spat. "Men like him don't die quiet. Someone will come a skin why." Abigail stepped forward then, eyes steady. "Then they'll get the truth, from me. Harlow murdered my husband. The land's mine by right, and any man who says otherwise can answer to the law, or to Luke Matthews." The men glanced at one another, realizing she wasn't the same frightened widow they'd once pitied. With no more words, they turned their horses and rode off. Luke watched her for a long moment. "You didn't need to do that," he said quietly. She smiled faintly. "Yes, I did." That night, the rebuilt barn glowed with lantern light. Rain tapped gently on the new roof, a sound that no longer carried fear. Luke sat on a hay bale, sharpening his knife, while Abigail mended a torn coat beside the small fire. "You still plan to sell?" he asked. She paused, needle hovering in the air. "I was going to," she admitted. "But every board we've nailed, every fence you fix, it feels less like something to leave and more like something to keep." He nodded slowly. "Maybe that's your husband's real legacy. Not what he lost, what you're building again." Her eyes softened. "And you? You'll keep drifting when this is done?" Luke's jaw tightened. Drifters don't plan that far ahead. She smiled, the kind that reached her eyes. Then maybe it's time one of them did. Days turned into weeks, and the land began to heal. But the guilt Luke carried didn't fade so easily. He'd taken a life, again, and every sunrise reminded him that peace always came with a price. One evening, he rode out to the ridge where Vern Harlow had fallen. The ground was soft now, the mud washed away, only a faint scar where blood had met rain. He removed his hat, standing in silence. Abigail found him there. "You can't carry forever," she said softly. "I know," he replied, "but if I forget, I might stop remembering why I fight." She stepped closer, placing a hand over his. "Then remember this instead. What you saved, not what you lost." He turned to her, eyes meeting hers, the storm inside him quieting. "You always see the light in the darkest places, don't you?" "Someone has to," she whispered, ran through the grass chasing a stray colt. Laughter echoing across the field. Luke stood on the porch, watching Abigail in the doorway. Sunlight catching the copper strands in her hair, the faintest smile playing on her lips. She looked up. "You fixin' to ride again?" He shook his head. "Thought I might stay a spell. A promise don't mean much if you ride off before it's kept." Abigail's breath caught slightly. "And what promise is that?" "That I'd help you keep what's yours," he said, stepping closer, his voice low and sure. "But maybe it's more than the land now." Her heart thudded softly. "You're a stubborn man, Luke Matthews." He smiled faintly. "Only when it's worth it." She reached up, fingers brushing the rough edge of his jaw. "Then maybe we're both guilty." The moment lingered, the air between them heavy, not with fear or pain, but with the unspoken truth that something new had been born in the ashes of what was lost. Months later, travelers passing through Red Rock Valley would speak of the widow who rebuilt her ranch with the help of a lone cowboy. They'd see two figures riding side by side across the golden hills at dusk, the rancher's widow and the drifter who chose to stay. And sometimes, when the wind carried just right, you could hear the faint echo of a man's voice, steady and calm. "You don't run from the past out here. You face it, and if you're lucky, you find someone worth facing it with." The camera pans wide across the horizon, sunlight spilling over the plains, the barn standing whole again, smoke rising gently from a chimney a home no longer haunted.